Good morning, everyone. This is Joel Beatson with Landscape Alberta. Welcome to the webinar on the Advanced Payments Program hosted by Landscape Alberta. Until very recently, APP was not available in Prairie, Canada, mostly due to a lack of an administrating body. It had not had a good uptake in the past in the Prairies and faded away. With the uncertainty around COVID-19 crisis, many were looking to apply for this federal program. Our good friend Jamie Albers with CNLA was able to find an administrating body and in record time able to secure agreements with all parties to make this happen. I'd like to offer a special thanks to Jamie. Well done, my friend. We're very lucky to have you on our team. Today we're joined by Saville from the Agri Commodity Management Association. Kara is going to take us through how the APP works and answer any questions you may have as growers. So Kara, please go ahead.
Thanks, Joel. So I just wanted to give you a little overview of what the Advanced Payments Program is, and also a little background on Agri Commodity Management Association, or ACMA, because our name is way too long. You'll hear me call it both. So this is what we're going to go through. So a little background on ACMA. We were formed about 10 years ago. We are located in Nova Scotia, and we were born out of the provincial cattle producers, sheep producers, and pork producers didn't have the funds to support their own office staff. So they got together with a little help from the provincial government and a little help from our provincial federation initially to form ACMA. So we do contract work for, I think, 14 different groups now. All levels. Some we just store their equipment and lend it out to their producers. Some we do full board management, financial management across the board. And then with that, we also brought the Advanced Payments Program and administering that. So it was administered by Pork Nova Scotia in the past. And then when ACMA was born, we took that over and have been doing it now for 10 years and growing the commodities that it's available to, the provinces it's available in. And now we're here. So a little background on what APP is. So it is a federally guaranteed loan program, and its purpose is to provide cash flow to get your product to market. ACMA, we're not a government agency, but we do administer the program on behalf of Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. In exchange, they guarantee our loans at the bank, and they cover the interest on the interest-free portion. So for the high points of APP, each farm or each producer is eligible for up to $1 million, depending on a couple of things that we'll go over in a minute, but that's the program maximum. The first $100,000 every year is always interest-free. And then the remaining whatever up to your maximum is prime minus a quarter. So right now prime is 2.45%. So we're even less than that. Money is cheap right now, but this is even cheaper than most. For nursery products, advances are available starting April 1st of every year. To be eligible for APP, the company needs to be, if it's a corporation, it needs to be majority interest owned by Canadians, so either permanent residents or Canadian citizens. If you're a sole proprietor, you must be a Canadian citizen or a permanent resident. You have to own the product and you have to be responsible for marketing it. And you must be enrolled in a business risk management program. And for nursery products, that is Agri Stability. When it comes time to calculate your advance amount, I'm sure most of you have seen the spreadsheet that I sent out, and we're going to go over it here in a second. But we're going to look at two things. One, we're going to get you to calculate your anticipated production, and that is using our advance rate. Our advance rates should be 50% of the market value, and it's a Canada-wide average, so it is may not be completely 50% of what your market value is, but it should be 50% of the average Canadian market value. As we go through this, as you're applying or calculating what you'd be eligible for, if you see anything that's really off, that is really far from what the actual market value is, or 50% of that, let me know, because we can request adjustments to that. They take a little bit of time, but we can always adjust the groupings or the pricing as needed. So we're going to look at two things. Like I said, we're going to look at that anticipated production, which is using our advance rate. And then we're going to compare that to your Agri Stability reference margin, which is on your enrollment notice, which I have just learned that you don't get in Alberta. So we're going to look at your last year's margin calculation to get that reference margin in Alberta. Then whichever of those two numbers is the lower is the maximum that we can advance. And the reason for that is the Agri Stability is our security while your product is growing. So we can't go above that Agri Stability reference margin, or we have an unsecured loan. Yep. So Agri Stability, for those that don't know, is a disaster relief program, and it's meant to help cover your agricultural income if something terrible were to happen. So it's not for a little blip in sales from year to year, but if, for example, no nurseries opened this year, that would be a disaster in your industry, and Agri Stability would ideally step in and have some sort of a payout. That would come, if you've received APP, that would come here to pay off your loan first, and anything extra would go to you. The best example I have of that is the mink industry. So about 6 years ago, we were advancing $32 a pelt, which should have been 50% of the market value, and pelts sold for $20. So we saw a lot of Agri Stability payments in that year that paid off or paid down the amount that they owed APP to help keep producers in the business. So that's Agri Stability's purpose. And like I said, it is our security while your product's growing. Normally you have to enroll, if you've never been enrolled in Agri Stability, you have to enroll by April 30th. That deadline has been extended for this year to July 3rd because of COVID-19. So if you have not currently enrolled in Agri Stability and you're interested in using APP, there is still time to do that. But I would suggest doing it now because it does take usually 4 to 6 weeks in a good year for them to come through the national group. I'm not sure if the provincially run ones in Alberta are a little faster, but I know the national one can take 4 to 6 weeks to come through with your enrollment notice. So the sooner you get that rolling, the better. So this is our example of how we would calculate your eligible amount. So this is the spreadsheet that I sent around. It's a little hard to see on this slide, I apologize. But what you're going to do is go through this sheet, and you're going to fill in the varieties over here of the products that you grow, and then what size you sell them at. So not what size they're currently at, but what size you're going to market them at. Fill in the quantities, and it will do the math for you. Up here in the right-hand corner, it will calculate that advance amount. There are a couple of tabs. So the one tab that I was just on was the nursery shrubs and flowering plants. There's also evergreens and a deciduous tree tab, as well as a missing rates. So if there's, then this top part here is an example of the missing rates. So if there's anything that's not listed on that and those other two tabs, you can fill it in here, and I will fill in the yellow space to try and fit it into one of the existing groups and get a rate, and then we can request an official rate for next year. The fourth tab on there is going to add up all 4 tabs and come up with your total advance requested. So that's the number that I'm going to take and compare to your reference margin to figure out which is the lower number and which is the maximum that we can advance on. So when we come down to calculating how much money you get deposited, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to take A, which is your anticipated production from that spreadsheet. B, I'm going to look at your reference margin. So in this example that's on the screen, your anticipated production is lower than your reference margin, so I can advance your full anticipated production. We have an administration fee, which if you're receiving the under 100,000 advance, the interest-free portion, that's the only fee that you'll get as long as you pay everything back on time. So what we do is we take your advance amount, we take the 50,000 out of the bank account, We take off our admin fee, keep that, give you the difference, and then you repay the $50,000 to the bank account when the time comes, so that you're not exceeding that maximum advance amount. This is a breakdown of our fees. We've broken it into a tiered system. So depending on the advance amount that you receive, that will determine your admin fee. And then if you were to get a second or a third installment, probably not in this first year because we're later into the season starting, but in a future year, if you wanted a little bit up front and then a second installment a little later in the year, you don't get dinged anything extra unless you go into the next tier. And I put on here that it's plus 15% HST, but that's incorrect. It's going to be plus whatever your provincial GST, PST combination is. So ignore that part of it. So then for repaying your advance, for most commodities, repayments are due within 30 days of you getting paid or 60 days of shipping. However, with nursery products, that's a bit cumbersome to try and keep track of every single item that goes and make sure it's repaid in the 30 or 60 days. So what we do with nursery is you can repay with up to 6 post-dated checks. You can do it in 4, you can do it in 6. They can be equal amounts. They can be whatever matches your cash flow. It's a little bit of a loophole that nursery and greenhouse products get that other commodities don't, which is great. And you should use that to your advantage. The good thing with these post-dated checks is if I don't have to hold any, when you apply and you get your approved amount, you're going to send me the post-dated checks in the mail. If you don't tell me to hold any or make any changes to that payment schedule, I don't ask to see any more sales proof. And then there's no risk of penalties. So I'm not going to know if you sold a little bit less than what we've given you money for, or if you sold more one month and should have repaid it, but didn't repay it till the next month. I'm not going to be able to cross-check any of that because we've stuck to your repayment plan. If you deviate from that repayment plan that you give me, then I have to start getting sales records to make sure that things were repaid generally on time, which is where we can get into a little bit of penalty situation if you didn't sell enough or if you didn't repay it on time. Final repayment is due within 12 months of receiving your advance or within 60 days of closing down for the winter. I assume that most places in Canada shut down for some period of time over the winter as far as sales go. And so that payments would be due within 60 days of that closing day. And then there are penalties for late payments or payments without proof of sale. But like I said, if you stick to your repayment plan, and you and I will discuss that when the time comes, you can't, if you start your sales in July, I'm not going to say that you can wait and pay it all back in December. It has to be as your sales are happening to some extent, but we're not going to dig fine tooth comb through everything if it's reasonable. So the application process, we do have forms that have to be completed. There are about 24 pages, but at least 10 of those are just terms and conditions. So it's not as daunting as it first seems. I also need to collect either passport or birth certificate to prove Canadian residency, your Agri Stability enrollment notice, or your previous year's reference margin calculation. Your most recent financials, a void check, incorporation certificate, shareholder agreement. And then once I get everything together, I'm going to run a credit check on my side and a lien registry search. We are also required to do an inspection. Obviously, geographically, we're not going to be able to do that before we give money out. But what we will do is Brad McCollum is my boss and does a bunch of cattle meetings out west a couple times a year. So we will try and schedule inspections to coincide with his trips that he's already going to have, help save some costs all around. And we'll work with you to set that up when the time comes. So, and that really is it. As long as you repay within the time that you're supposed to, then there's no additional fees other than your admin fee and interest above the 100,000. The first 100,000 every year is always interest free. And that is my contact information. So I'll open it up now if anyone has any questions.
We'll give it a minute or so
Yep.
to see if any questions come in on the chat. That is on the right-hand side of your screen, folks. If you want to type your question in there, I'll read it out loud and we can have Kira answer that. I'll just also say, a big thank you also to ACMA and for stepping up and really making this happen. And of course, AAFC, Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, for making this happen so fast in such a trying time. I've never heard about anything coming quite this fast in terms of from preliminary discussion to signed agreement. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah, and I know AAFC was very happy to have this program available to producers out there. So we're happy to help.
Great. I had one question as I was listening here, and I know it's more about Agri Stability, but maybe you have some info on it. Is how much would sales have to drop to be considered a disaster? I know, like we're hearing in British Columbia that some of the nurseries and greenhouses out there have had 95% drops in sales, which is
wow,
a clear disaster. But and then we have like the wage subsidy, where the federal government's asking to show a 30% drop in revenue.
Mm-hmm.
But do you have any indication of where that would have to be to apply for this year?
Yeah, so payments right now, as Agri Stability sits right now, you'd have to have a 30% drop. So it would have to be 70% of previous year's
revenue
values to trigger a payment. And the payment depends on a lot of things, and it gets further into Agri Stability than I know. But nothing is triggered until you have that 30% drop.
Great. I think that's useful, just as as I said in our little test run, is the snow has finally left the ground in the last week or so here in Alberta, and I think maybe a little earlier in some of the other parts of the prairies. But it's we're hopeful for the season, but it's everyone's cautious with how it's going to go based on what we're seeing out of Quebec and Ontario and BC, right? So.
Yeah. Well, and on that, so the program as it sits right now is still due back. If when you apply, we're going to set a repayment schedule. It can be pushed until your first payment can be pushed till August, 1st of September kind of thing. But we would have to establish that ahead of time. Yeah. If things go terribly wrong market-wide, there is a clause within APP that we can ask for an extension. And so right now, payments are due within 12 months of getting your money or 60 days of shutting down for the winter. So I imagine most people shut down in November. So most people should have this fully repaid by mid-January-ish. And I welcome any corrections if that's wrong. But so that's where we stand until things change. So if something happens market-wide, we can ask for an extension of that final repayment deadline, but it would have to be a market-wide issue, or at least a provincial market-wide issue. It doesn't have to be Canada-wide. Mm-hmm. But until that, make sure you have all your eggs in one basket. I'm not going to count on anything coming through until it does. Yeah. So we would still work under the guise that it's due back kind of mid-January. And if something happens, we will adjust accordingly.
Yeah, and I'd look forward to hearing from the producers. When it comes with that, I know there's some concern going into the season about receivables and
for sure,
and making sure they're on top of those things through the season. So
yeah,
that in theory should work, but there's always some receivables that probably go past January. But and we have a question here from Joanne who says, "Are you able to request the $100,000 no ties to the higher amount?"
Yes. So what we'll go through and do is figure out what you're eligible for based on that spreadsheet and your reference margin. But just because you're eligible for it doesn't mean you have to take it. Nursery doesn't have a set advance cutoff date, but it would be August-ish. So you'd want to take out anything that you want before August. But you don't have to take the full eligible amount. You can take just the 100,000 if you only need 50,000. If you just want to you have enough cash flow, but you just want to have a buffer, you can take a portion of it, put it in a GIC, and then pay it back on time just to make sure you have extra cash flow if needed. We don't need proof of what the money's spent for, just proof of sales on the payback side.
And we have a question from Jamie here. Does ACNA need a priority agreement with a grower's financial institution?
We will need priority agreements with anyone that has a lien on either a general security on the operation or a lien on the specific commodity. If we go over the 400,000, which was the old program maximum, we also need priority agreements from anyone that has a lien. So that's your tractor dealers, that's your everything, which takes a little bit longer. But under that 400,000, we need them from any general securities or liens on the commodity specific. Usually that does mean your bank, but it doesn't necessarily. It depends on how they have things registered and the wording they use. And that's part of the search that I'll do once I get the application in.
Excellent. Well, I'm not seeing any more questions here, but Kara's contact information is going to be available on this last slide as we talk through questions. So if you have any other questions, maybe more specific to your business, you'll be able to contact her directly. And then we are, as always, recording these webinars. And not long after this is over, we'll get a processed video version of that, and then we'll upload it to YouTube for sharing on the Landscape Alberta website, and with our partners in Saskatchewan and Manitoba as well. We really thank you, Kara, for coming on today, and to Jamie and AAFC and ACMA and CNLA, acronym soup right before lunch, and then and wish everybody the best coming into the season, and hopefully you really don't have to take advantage of Agri Stability and too much to make this work this year.
Okay. Well, thanks so much, Joel.
Thank you. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.